So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our beginner's guide to fundraising for international NGOs. We're doing this webinar because we've been having lots more inquiries from smaller NGOs who are facing additional fundraising challenges in the face of kind of aid cuts globally and the shifting geopolitics. So, we hope this is helpful for lots of people. It is being recorded and we'll put this on our website so you or colleagues can look back at a later time if you kind of miss anything today. And we'll do questions at the end. So please do throughout the session, pop your questions in the Q&A and we'll address all those at the end of the slides. So let's get started. We'll just go through a quick agenda for the webinar. So we're going to cover the following topics. Thinking about why fundraising matters and how impactful fundraising could be to your organisation. And critically, what you need to do to be funder ready. So in terms of actually going out there and asking for money. And this is a challenge a lot of smaller NGOs face in that they perhaps haven't thought through quite all the steps you need to take and all the ducks you need to have in a row in order to be ready to approach those funders successfully. A key part of that is your case for support. So what is it you're doing and why? What is the impact you're going to have? The cost breakdown, etc. And we'll go through all of that and what you should have in your case for support. The types of funders you might apply to. And with that, understanding the difference in UK and US fundraising landscapes. And then finally, a few tips on where to find those grants. So who should you be applying to? Who's suitable for your organisation or your project? And then those mistakes, tips and resources as we go through. So, Connor, welcome. I should also introduce myself. My name's Amy and I'm Chief Exec at Gifted and I'm joined by Connor, who's one of our senior consultants. So, Connor, tell us why fundraising matters. Talk us through.
Hi. Why fundraising matters. So this is things that sometimes get missed because the obvious answer to that question is because we need more money to do our work. And although that is kind of the most obvious one, there's a few things that's really important to realize about this, which is why we mentioned it first, because these questions actually impact sort of what we will talk about later and how you can approach funding as well. So, scale and sustainability. So it's more than just growing and doing more. It's knowing that you've got, a clear pathway to scaling up your work cost effectively. Things like that are really appealing to funders as well. And it's important for you also internally to have that sort of roadmap, if you will, of financials rather than going grant to grant as much as you can. Resilient and independence. By that, we more mean about being resilient to, changes in sort of the wider funding landscape and other global issues that are quite largely out of your control. Being able to be resilient in terms of having, say, more unrestricted funding and things like that. They really enable you to adapt how you work and sustain yourself rather than being fully reliant on maybe one source of income, for example, which may then sort of vanish due to issues completely outside of your control. New partnerships as well. The more you raise, the more that other larger funders, for example, may be interested, including other NGOs that you could partner with to do projects on the ground. Now, the caveat to that is as you grow in size, there will be maybe smaller funders and pots of grants which aren't available to you, but it's a mix and match. Demonstrating credibility. Now, credibility is confidence. It's the ability to gain other funding over time. That really gives confidence to new funders, for example, that you're able to run an NGO really effectively and manage the grant that they may give you effectively as well. Anything that you can do to get rid of those sort of red flags from a new organization, potentially, giving a bank transfer of money to another new organization, it really just helps, remove that red flag, so to speak. And of course, impact and growth, the ability to make that bigger difference by investing more money into the services that you're running. So are you funder ready? This is a really, really important question. The first one there, which Amy will talk about in more detail in a moment, is around your case of support. This is like the foundation document, which talks about sort of everything you do, why, how, and more in kind of a short brief. Case studies, testimonials, things like, surveys, getting quotes from the people that you're supporting, all those sort of things, really, really vital. They give that sort of emotional as well as the qualitative evidence really to back up an application for when you're applying for funding. Theory of changes, not always, not always relevant, especially for smaller organizations. It really depends on the size of the grants that you're going for, and there's a few different ways of doing that. There's some great templates online. If it is necessary to do a theory of change, the funder will almost always say it. But if you have one, then it's really great to have that in mind as well and mention it in an application if you have the space. Um,
And
Obviously,
they can be different levels, right, Connor? So it can be very complex or actually quite simple, a theory of change, can't it?
oh yeah, there's loads of ways of doing them. There's no sort of you get some really complex ones for very large sort of multifaceted organizations, and then you can have relatively quite straightforward ones, which
Yeah.
quite just neatly and visually explains how you do the work that you do, and it's really useful just as an internal frame of reference sometimes as well. So to get everybody sort of involved and really understanding how everyone connects to the wider mission, it's really really powerful just as an internal tool sometimes.
Yeah.
Um, a registered entity with a bank account. So, of course, an absolute necessity, depending on the country that you are primarily based in. We'll talk about this a bit later on about the differences between sort of UK and USA funding requirements as well. But where you are legally registered as well as where your bank account is legally registered can actually be two different things, and there are different implications for that as well. So it's just important to understand that and be transparent around that. Having a track record or considering a pilot. So a track record of success, by that we mean if you're applying for funding for a particular type of project, for example, clearly demonstrating the projects that you've done before as examples, that's why we mentioned about case studies and testimonials and that. But of course, if you're still quite young as an NGO or it's a new project, especially, you can absolutely frame it as a pilot. You can still demonstrate the need really clearly, what you will do, but you can start much smaller, and you can use almost like the initial funding that you need as a pilot test, so to speak. It'll be a much smaller grant typically because there's a lot less risk to a funder to sort of to fund a riskier project because it's not been done before. And then the benefit of doing that is that you potentially have a high chance of getting that grant. You can do it successfully and then do all the monitoring and the evaluation and get the success stories from within that. And then you've got your foundation to apply for bigger grants to do that project again. Audited and transparent financials. Of course, you need to keep updated reporting per your sort of your country's standards, and it would depend on the country where you're legally registered. But more than the sort of the minimum legal requirement of financial reporting, many funders will want to see, specifics such as the breakdown of costs for your project in an application. Some of them will be fine to be quite top level, so total salary costs, total travel costs for a project. But some will really appreciate you digging a lot deeper than that, and that typically happens. The larger grants that you get, they're going to really want to see very specific costings. So it's really, really important to bear that in mind as well and have that information ready to go before you start applying. A working website and an online presence. Absolutely not. It doesn't have to be the best looking website in the world by any measure. Even a very basic website which just details sort of who you are, maybe what you've done and why you do it is absolutely fine. It just helps improve your credibility, so that if a funder is interested, and they do that initial due diligence to check out who you are online to just make sure that you do exist and you are doing work. If you don't have that website, that could just be the red flag enough for them to say no, which would be a shame. And lastly, we'll talk about this in a bit more detail a bit later, but being set up to really do that monitoring and evaluation work is really, really, really important.
Brilliant. So, In starting to think then about kind of preparing yourself for applying for funding, some considerations about what your work looks like and making sure you're delivering that in the best way possible that's going to be as impactful and as engaging as possible. So think about who is the public facing lead for your project. And alongside that, think about, are you considering with your team that's delivering the project any cultural nuances, any norms or traditions in the delivery of that? A great example, which I'll talk about later on today, is a project I've been working with in Kenya, GACA, which is a menstrual hygiene poverty campaign, and thinking about kind of the cultural norms about women talking to each other about this kind of issue with regards to men being involved as well, because obviously our board is mixed and the founder is actually male as well. Thankfully, that's not having an impact on delivery, but it's really important you think about these things. And it's not, particularly if you're an NGO based in the UK that is delivering overseas, you're really understanding the environment in which you're delivering that project. So you can ensure, how do you know your beneficiaries will engage in that project? Make sure you do the research on the ground to ensure whatever it is you're putting in place is going to be well received. And critical to that is local support. So if you've got community leaders and others backing the project, it's much more likely to be successful. Finally, make sure you're not duplicating other services or programs. Now, that's not to say that there might not be two very similar projects running in kind of neighboring towns or cities in an area. That's absolutely fine because, an organization might not be able to spread more widely. But if that is the case, as you're building together your fundraising picture and your narrative, think about telling that story and say, this organization in the neighboring town does also do similar work to us, but we have very specific regions. However, we might partner up together. So as Connor mentioned earlier in the opening slides, partnerships are really, really key. And we've seen funders shift significantly, particularly with the changes in aid budgets, to looking at organisations who are collaborating, who are making best use of resource and are working together. So do think about that as you map out your project. Then the case for support. So how do you tell your story about what it is you're trying to do? First of all, we're going to think about the need. So what is the need? And let's get some statistics behind that. If there are local demographic statistics about kind of, the problem that you're trying to solve, really state that and demonstrate how important it is that you're doing this work. Then you're looking at your solution. So what is it that you're doing to address this need? And how you go about that. What does the delivery program look like? What are the timelines for that delivery? And critically, what's the impact of your work? And we always say, with any campaign, big or small, really, really focus on the positives. So, of course, we've got to demonstrate the need. We've got to be factual and say this is a problem that we need to solve. But actually, the language of opportunity and inspiring people to be part of something that is really making a difference is incredibly powerful. So when you talk about that impact, be really clear to focus on those short and long-term positives that you're going to have through your work. The project and budget breakdown is super important. And just reflecting back on what Connor was saying there about kind of your financial transparency, don't be afraid in your budget breakdown to be really clear about what it is you actually need. So if you're thinking, oh gosh, well, we really could do with some AV equipment for when we're doing these presentations to a local group or whatever it is you're doing, but you're worried that it will be seen as too expensive, don't. You need to be really clear about exactly what it takes to deliver your project or your pilot project to the best of your ability. Because if you exclude that, funders will actually look at it and think, this actually isn't, hasn't really been thought through. So don't be afraid to include your full budget breakdown in there. You also need to kind of reflect in your case for support on sustainability, so long-term sustainability of the project, your governance of your organization, making sure that you are properly registered, that you have structures in place, you're reporting properly. As Connor's going to talk about, your monitoring and evaluation, and then finally case studies. Case studies are so important and so impactful. So, who have you helped in the past? Who can stand up and say, this is the difference it's made to me? So think about all those things as you pull together your case for support. Connor.
Great. So, onto a bit more detail around that monitoring and the evaluation. And if this is a term which is maybe a bit newer to you as well, if you're quite a young NGO potentially, this is effectively how you gather the evidence that your ongoing sort of project is a success, or uh, things where it's maybe not working as well, which I'll talk about in a moment. So this is really, really, really vital. Now, a lot, if not pretty much every funder, when you get a grant, will tell you the kind of monitoring and evaluation that they expect before you accept a grant, because there are circumstances where sometimes a funder may just simply ask so much that you physically can't get that and fulfill that obligation, and that's where you can have a really honest conversation. But they will often tell you what they need and how they want it, and you can then sort of go away and hopefully not at that stage think about how to get it because you would have already prepped this work. So this could be anything from quotes and testimonials from maybe people that you've supported. Impact measurements like the number of people that you delivered a workshop to, for example. Um, all these sort of things. It really, really depends on the project that you've got. It could be, if you're a local tree planting organization, it could be the number of seedlings and then the success rate and the survival rates. And then there could be other measurements for the people supported locally. And there's so many variables in this to think about, but on the screen there is just a few really good examples. But the key thing is knowing that you've got the capacity already established to be able to gather this information internally. So, for example, do your teams know who will be collecting the data? For example, delivering a survey to the people that you may be supporting over, say, a 2 or 3 year project. That's a really good example because not only are surveys really, really good, sort of quite easier ways to gather a lot of information, but it's really important to plan that in advance because, for example, you could easily your chance to actually collect that data if you need to collect it, say, when you deliver a workshop. And if that isn't been sort of pre-planned for who is going to write, say, a survey and then deliver it after that workshop, it's going to be really difficult, if not impossible, to then find those people afterwards and then try information again. Standing these things into the actual application that you're making is really, really important. It's not just about we're going to do the work and, oh, okay, we'll try to just get some information to sort of please the funder, so to speak. These things are really important to not only give you a lot more credibility that you know what you're doing and gaining that evidence to prove that the success of your work is really, really helpful. But importantly, this is also how you as an organization learns from the successes and the potential failures of your project as well, so you can continue to evolve that. So we're at that last point now where it mentions about being transparent about the challenges and the risks. This is something where even a lot of very experienced fundraisers get quite nervous about, but I have never seen a charitable project that is 100% perfect without any kind of risk. I don't know if one exists. So it's really important to be completely transparent around the risks. These could be financial risks, operational risks, local sort of cultural risks, all the different things you can think about. State them clearly, how you know it, rank them, how much of a risk you think it is, and then outline what you've got in place to mitigate that. If you can be open about that, you'll have a much stronger chance of actually getting the grant in the first place. And also, as an organization, it allows you to learn from any failures that maybe do happen in the project. And actually, that won't, in most cases, I would say, be seen as a bad thing from the funder's perspective. It will actually be seen as a good thing because they'll see that you've done everything right, and because you've got these systems in place, you're now able to learn from previous things that didn't go wrong and deliver an even better project the next time you request funding, and that's really, really appealing.
And there's also templates, isn't there, Connor, on risk kind of management and registers that kind of have, they call it a RAG register, so red, amber, and green, where you rate kind of how serious that risk might be. So if you look online, there's loads of templates that you can do this really simply. It sounds like quite a daunting task, but actually it's an evolving document, isn't it, that as an organization you should have on the go continually, and that you update here and there and remove risks as they, become obsolete and whatnot. So it's not as time consuming or as challenging as you might initially think, but it's super, super important.
Yeah, and it's often the case as well that actually a lot of funders will have a specific question in their application that says, "Tell us about learnings that you made from
Yeah,
the last time you ran this project," for example. That's a really common question.
yeah.
And I think it's a very valid question as well. So this will really help. Now, it's not every type of funder, of course. There's a lot of nuances in this, but these are really sort of the six main types of funding sources in this space that you can maybe expect to look at. The first one is obviously trusts and foundations. So your charitable grant makers across the world, not just in, say, the UK and the US, but all over the world, including entirely global ones. Government funders, obviously, USAID is sort of less of a thing now, but there are many other government and statutory-led funders. All sorts of individual countries in the EU, for example, are good examples to look at, particularly if you've got like embassies. Your country has an embassy in, say, a European government, then they will often have their own pots of funding as well. So that's a really good source to look at, if nothing else. Um, Religious funders, like Catholic Relief Services. There's all sorts of like religion specific focus funders, which if that's relevant to you, is absolutely worth looking at. Corporate donors. So typically larger businesses that operate around the world or specifically in your country will often have big CSR and grant making programs. They may even have their own charitable foundations as well. You've got large in your country, particularly ones that are maybe from that originate from quite often have CSR ESG programs to look into. Uh, Slightly different is crowdfunding platforms. There's many different options around, but some of them will do times of the year where they'll do match funding as well. So you can actually apply to crowdfunder on that platform. But some of those donations can get, say, that company's own sort of staff fundraising, for example, sort of crowdfunder based on the crowdfunder website. For example, it's a really good example there to look into, and it enables you to actually directly fundraise as well rather than applying for grants. So slightly different. And we talked about this earlier, but really, really important for international NGOs, especially, is those partnerships with other charities and NGOs. So it may not be as black and white, for example, as applying to that NGO for a grant, but it's a tried and tested case of a larger NGO that does or wants to operate in the country that you work in, doing similar things. So community health, for example, they will often actively seek partnerships with the local on the ground NGOs, potentially like yourselves, to do that work, and they can channel a funding to enable that to happen. And those are really good sources to look into as well.
Definitely. And I think it's important to say about the religious funders particularly. So Connor mentioned CRS, which is a big organization. You don't necessarily have to be a religious organization to receive funding from them. So, some of the big funders in this space will happily fund humanitarian issues, community health projects, and they're doing so with the ethos of the faith that's behind their organisation. So don't count them out because you think, well, we're not a Catholic organisation or what have you. They really do fund a significant scope. So do think about that. Okay, so thinking then about what funders are looking for in your application and in you as an organisation. So obviously it's the impact that you're having and the long-term sustainability of any project that you're working on. But with that, remember, as Connor was mentioning about failures, it's a project you can deliver a project and say, actually, we probably wouldn't do it quite the same again because we learned X, Y, and Z. So sustainability is also about pivoting and making sure future projects are delivered in the most impactful way. Strong leadership and governance, we've been through this, but making sure, you're compliant within whatever country you're operating in terms of governance, financial reporting, and any registration with charitable entity. Evidence of community involvement and community-led programs. This is so, so important. The projects that get funded are more often than not being run on the ground because funders then know that, this is not, let's use the UK as an example. An organization from the UK going over to, let's say, an organization in Kenya, because we've used that example earlier, and kind of imparting their knowledge and their training and whatever it is on a local community. There's far better engagement when people locally are delivering that project. And that kind of links into what we've talked about in other webinars as well with Global North versus Global South. And funders are really wanting to see empowerment of communities in the Global South in leading their own charitable projects. So really think about that community-led program. And particularly as well, if the community has helped you shape your program that you're putting together to deliver, can be really impactful. Clear budgets and financial oversight, as we've said, and again, that past success or learning from failure. So what worked really well, what didn't, and how have you shifted to learn from that and move forwards? The clear evidence of need, especially if you're local and on the ground. So really evidence with some statistics. It's okay to say we'd like this to happen, but why? Where is that need really coming from? Think about any partnerships and associations. As we've said, partnerships can make you a lot stronger, even if that's just, we're not necessarily working in partnership with somebody, but we're in close communication with this fellow organization and we share knowledge and whatnot. Really, really engaging for a funder. And finally, those case studies, stories, and quotes that can really demonstrate the difference that you're making for your beneficiaries. So Connor, talk us through the differences between the UK and US fundraising.
Fab. So, the two I would say most important things to know first of all is that there's two ways that you become a registered charity in either country. So, in the UK, it's the UK Charity Commission registration, and in the USA, it's typically 501c3. There are some outliers around that, such as 501c4 for more like political organizations, but typically those are the two. Now, particularly for the US, they are not necessarily easy and quick to get. So that's really important to know that this isn't going to be a quick, oh, let's a very quick and easy and free thing to be able to do to unlock funding. It does require a lot of thinking and pre-planning and looking into. It's also really worth considering that for pretty much any trust and foundation, although not exclusively. It's common for trusts not to provide grants for, say, the first 3 years of being formally registered. And that goes back to what we said around those red flags and having that credibility so that they know that you have been operating and likely receiving grants from other sources or general funding in that country as a registered, say, charity in one of those countries for 3 years. That gives them enough strength to say that you've been doing this at least for a few years now. You're reliable enough for us to sort of at least take a risk on funding your projects, and that's really important to know. Where your bank is located. Now, this is important to know. So it if you're registered with the UK Charity Commission, for example, you don't necessarily have to have your bank account registered in the UK, but you may do depending on the grant. So, that, like Amy said a moment ago, there could be funds where it will be really advantageous, if not essential, to be registered in the UK, but they want to fund locally led work in the global south, for example, if that applies to you. And sometimes, and we've come across this even recently, a funder will actually, they don't want to channel money into, say, a non-global South bank account because they want to make sure that the money is actually going to the people on the ground. So it really depends on the funder, but it's something just to consider. And this is why taking the time to do that research of your pipeline of potential funders is really important, because you can make a very educated you know, not necessarily a guess, but you can take a good go at understanding where you should maybe be registered, as well as maybe you should have your bank to maximize the funding opportunities that you've got. And lastly, around UK overseas territories, if this applies to you, where you're based and where you work, of the 14 UK overseas territory countries, some funders will say that you can either be registered with the UK Charity Commission or a UK overseas territory country. So if that applies to you and you are there, this may open more doors for you without having to be, say, UK Charity Commission registered. They will have their own requirements, but again, similar to where your bank is located, if this applies to you when you're doing your sort of research into funders out there, really important to maybe look at that, because it may be the case that actually for your top funders, you may not even need to go through an additional hurdle, and that's just something important to bear in mind there.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it, Connor? Because as a small NGO, let's say, I don't know, you're in India, for example, it might not be feasible initially to register with the UK Charity Commission because it's just a step too far, and obviously there's costs involved in doing so. Um, but it does open a lot, a plethora of funders, doesn't it? And we found that when we were working with a small NGO in Nepal, um, delivering fantastic work in local communities, violence against women projects and economic empowerment. But the number of funders available for them to apply to was much smaller because they didn't have those registrations. So one thing to think about is if you are a really small NGO and, are currently registering in other countries is a step too far, is there a very similar charity registered, perhaps let's use UK as an example, with the UK Charity Commission, who could accept that gift on your behalf? And obviously you would then pay them an administration fee for doing that and processing that for you. But that can also be a way to kind of overcome that hurdle as you grow a bit more. So it can be very daunting to look at and seeing all these different registrations, but there are ways that you can gradually make that work as you grow as an organisation. Connor, back to you for finding the grant funders.
Great. So we've got a slide here for the UK and then a slide for the US. This is not an exhaustive list of funders, so we won't go through each one, in detail, because this presentation will be available for free and to look at yourselves as well. But this is a good example of some platforms. Some of them are free. Some of them are like say a relatively small subscription to sign up for. There's a variety of different options here to just to be able to browse trusts and foundations, especially, and options for you. So these are some really good ones in the UK. For the US, these are also some really good options here, but there are more than this. But this should give you a really good starting place to start building that pipeline and researching. The key thing is with all of these is to research very relevant and of course eligible funding options. If they're not eligible based on the criteria, it's almost always not worth applying, even though it can seem quite daunting to get rid of them for the time being. But the relevancy is really, really important, because the more closely relevant you are to something that a funder is interested in, the better chance you have of success, as well as all the things that we've talked about in this webinar. So yeah, that's a
Yeah.
really good to start looking.
And remember, this will all be available online, so you'll be able to see all these links afterwards. Don't worry about scribbling them down as we skip through the slides. But that point about relevance is super important because you will, as a small NGO, you will have limited time with your and resource for your fundraising. So by focusing really on a smaller number of applications to those who where you really, really fit their criteria, rather than going out there and trying to hit as many as possible, you will have much higher success rates. So really important point. Okay, so just talk through, reflect a little bit on a case study. So I mentioned earlier, I've been working with GACA, the Global Agency for Community Acceleration. Jerem's there in that picture, who is the founder locally in Homa Bay County, where the project is being led. So this is a menstrual hygiene project. The statistics for young women dropping out of school due to lack of access to menstrual hygiene materials and sanitary products is astonishing. And those small changes can make a huge difference. So again, as we spoke about, what we're actually doing here is running a pilot so we can get that monitoring and evaluation in place. We can prove that there's a significant increase in school attendance, but also in that kind of qualitative data from the girls and young women in how they feel about themselves and the impact it's actually having on their day-to-day life um, through having access to this program. So the pilot here is really important, and hopefully then, and we've done that through a crowdfunding project. That will then enable us to have that data to go to some of the funders and say, listen, we know this works. We can now roll this out in small increments, bringing in larger and larger groups of girls to make an impact. Um, there's a case study about this on our website as well, so you can read a bit more about what happened there. But yeah, for us, the pilot was really, really critical in making sure we could prove the difference that the project has made. Connor, what are some of the common mistakes to avoid as NGOs navigate this funding landscape?
Yeah, so as we just said about relevancy, applications that aren't relevant to the funder, it's becoming more and more common for, say, trusts and foundations to be quite overwhelmed by the amount of applications that they're getting, and it's quite often simply not worth your time applying to get a grant just on sort of the off chance that they might accept it. Not that it can't happen, but with limited resource and time to invest into fundraising, if something's not clearly, obviously relevant to your charity or your project, it's quite often a mistake to spend your time drafting that application. Um, Asking for funding without a plan. So we've sort of detailed quite a lot of the different things to really put into a project plan, which really is effectively what your application is. It's the emotional project plan in a sense. Um, you need to have a very clear way of describing how you're going to do that project, how it, not just from the beginning, but through it and then afterwards, which includes all that monitoring and evaluation work, the financials, the risks. That embodies a clear plan of action as well as how you're going to learn from it and monitor it and report back to them. Without that, it'll be quite a strong mistake to make on that one. Um, Over promising on impact is something that actually is quite a difficult one because on the one hand, you really need to almost over embellish what you do and the impact of what you do and like why it's so important and amazing and the case studies you get. And that is really, really important. But there's a balance in almost like the time and the place to do that. So, for example, when you're talking about when you're actually giving case studies and quotes and examples of where you've done this sort of project before, maybe that's the really, really good time to talk about the actual impact that you have achieved. What you don't want to do is when you're talking about the likely outcomes of this project, is to give very, very sort of overinflated numbers, for example, and things that they just is likely not going to happen. And because if you know that, then it's quite easy for a funder to see, oh wow, if you're only asking for say this amount of money and you're going to help that many people, how likely is that? And if it is genuinely a very high number of, say, people that you could help, for example, for a low cost, um, that goes back to the plan. You need to really clearly outline how that's going to happen, because it'll be quite obvious for a funder to tell if you're maybe sort of embellishing those figures too much, and that's quite important to recall there. Yeah, failing to report or follow up, absolutely essential. So funders will almost always tell you when and how to report information to them. That is an absolute necessity. It was pretty much will be the case 99% of the time that if you don't do that, you won't be getting funding from them again, for relatively obvious reasons. It's important to recognize there, though, that if things go wrong during the project, say you have a 3-year project that's been funded, and they want a yearly update. If you don't have the information ready to get them at, say, year one in, because various things have maybe gone wrong, the timelines have shifted, don't just not send them. Just speak to the funder. They are interested in your project. They're literally invested in your project, and they want it to succeed. They will absolutely understand if you're clear to them and completely transparent and tell them, we just want to keep you updated. The timelines have maybe moved slightly because of XYZ reasons. We've handled it with this, but we're going to maybe need an extra month or two to give you that reporting, for example. That's absolutely the best thing to do, than simply not delivering that. And as we've talked about several times now, not clearly identifying the need, the impact, and why you specifically are the best to fill that need. So that's a really important point there, because a lot of funders they'll get so many applications, and they could quite easily compare, your application to 5 others which may look really similar, in terms of like the impacts and the work that you're doing that could happen. So what you want to do is clearly demonstrate why you as an organization and what you do is either uniquely placed to deliver that impact, or is best placed to do it. And that goes back to really understanding your organization, why you exist in the first place. And if you can't answer that question on why we are like really well equipped and or possibly unique to fill this need, then that's something to maybe go back with, initially as well. As for some free resources and templates to look into, there's lots of like social media communities for the charity sector, Facebook groups and things like that, which are really helpful to ask questions in. They've also got a lot of resources on them in like a files section sometimes on Facebook groups, for example. So you can view successful applications that people have done to funders, and budget templates. Those are really good examples if you're still relatively new to, say, grant funding and writing applications, because you can see how people may have structured and written different types of applications, and you'll get 2-page ones, you'll get 10-page ones, and they're all quite nuanced, but it could really help you just get the foundations of being able to sort of fill in those gaps, and that's a really good starting point sometimes. Also, really important to download each funder's application guidelines and the questions that they're going to ask as well. Often you can download them in advance before you actually start the process of applying. So what you can do is just put those questions, say you've got 10 funders you want to apply to, put them all into a document and just start putting all your information in, and then you can start, refining the messaging of those things, and you can have that as an ongoing working document that will actually make it better and easier to apply for more funds in the future, because you've got that information there, rather than finding a new question, which will happen, but rather than finding a new question halfway through an application, realizing you don't have all that information, then having to go back internally, realize it's going to take a month to get it, and then the deadline is gone, and you don't want to go back and forth. You want to just know everything that you need to know, have the answers, and then you can do a really convincing application. And our own website, of course, we've got a lot of other resources available online on the fundraising resources section, various webinars, and lots more stuff there to have a look at.
Thanks, Connor. So we're going to go to questions, but if I just skip forward a slide because you mentioned the resources as well. Like I say, lots on the website there, but we also have a couple of books that we've prepared. Gifted Fundraising is an overall approach to fundraising and the different kind of types and sources of funding. And then gifted asking is about asking for the money. If you would like any complimentary copies of that, get in touch with Julie, our colleague, and she will have those mailed out to you. So do feel free to do that. So questions in the Q&A for anybody. We do have one in there from Chaitana, who's asking how Gifted can assist Indian NGOs in fundraising from the UK. Yes, absolutely, we can do that. For us, it's about understanding what you really need as an organisation. So we'd recommend reaching out to us. We can have a an initial Zoom call or Teams call, and we can then advise how best to support. But yes, we can support small organisations from wherever you are, dependent on if we can meet your needs, which is why that call is really important to be bespoke. Any other questions from anyone coming in on the Q&A? I don't think there is. Any final reflections, Connor, from today's session?
No, just I think the thing for me is that there's, especially with things like the USAID cuts when that all happened, it was a very sort of negative space for obvious reasons, and there was a lot of unsurety and people quite rightly very scared about the future of, say, funding international development work. But I think it's really important to know that yes, it was a major source and of income and a major loss, but there are so many options out there and different ways of doing things, and that it's just being having that resilience and that nuance to really approach things differently. There are options. It's not all doom and gloom. There are, sort of relentless amount of fantastic organizations continuing to do really good work, even really small on the ground, as well as larger. If you've got a good case and a clear need, there will be people that really want to help, and I think it's just finding them and convincing them.
Absolutely. We just had another question in while you're talking there, Connor. So, do Indian NGOs need UK registration to seek funds from the UK? No, you do not have to. There are funders in the UK, Europe, and globally that will support organisations in India that don't have UK reg, for example. However, there's a lot bigger pool of funders, the more kind of access you have to that. So as I spoke about earlier, potentially partnering with an organisation that already has charity registration who could accept gifts on your behalf, at least in the first instance, would be a great first step. But as you've asked here, yes, we can also help, and we do support charities in setting up their UK registrations as well. That said, we are not solicitors. You quite often need a legal team to give that a once over, but we can advise on your objectives and how you go about that and what the process is. Absolutely. So I think that's all my questions. Yeah, just finally then to kind of reiterate what Connor's been saying, it is tough out there, but it is possible. And there are so many small NGOs and larger NGOs, but particularly smaller ones doing incredible work out there. And believe in yourselves, go through these steps, make sure you are getting everything together. And yeah, that there is still money out there. And we just had a lovely thank you. Thank you, Lena. Saying, we're being reminded of the essentials, which is really important. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Like I say, this is recorded and will be available on our website in a couple of days. And do get in touch with us, reach out if there's anything you need, explore our resources on the website. And thanks to you all. We'll see you again soon. Thank you, Connor.
Thank you all.
All right, take care, everybody.